Welcome back to Supply Chain Management. In this video, we are talking about forecasting and the really closely related concept of uncertainty. And then we'll talk about the qualitative and quantitative methods of forecasting. And finally, we'll touch upon time series or the pattern of data that we can use to forecast. So forecasting is about predicting future demand based on past demand information. So we can look in this graph, we can see we have 6 blue dots. So we have 6 points of data of sales that occurred in the past. And our task is to determine exactly where the red dot, so we want to forecast where July sales will be, exactly how many units we will sell in July. So we will look at past data to predict the future. Let's look more concrete terms and let's see if you can get a feeling of exactly what our operations we on a daily basis do to create forecasts in our minds. Let's go back to our fast track case. You remember our manufacturer of bikes. And we look, they were selling not just bikes, but also bike parts. And we're going to look at wheels, saddles, and handlebars. And in this chart here, we look at 8 months of previous sales data. So if we have from January to August, we can see how much we sold of each of these 3 items. And our task is to determine what the forecast will be for September. So as a first task, when you're forecasting an item, it is very helpful to actually display the past data in a graph. In this case, I've done it here at the bottom. You can see how the top blue line here represents the past sales data of wheels. This pink upward sloping, more straight line represents the past sales of saddles. And at the bottom, we have a slower moving item, which is the handlebars. Let's focus on the first. So here we have the data for past sales of the wheels. You can see how in January we sold 490 wheels, then 510, 480, 500, 500 again, 520, 490, and 510. Okay, based on these numbers, what would you guess the forecast for September would be? What kind of reasoning do you use? Think about it for a second and then write down your best guess so that we can discuss it later on in class. So then we can actually move to the next item. Let's look at saddles. You can see how the sales data actually the pattern is quite different than we had for wheels. And here are the numbers. We have January we sold 240, then 250, 260, 270, 275, 280, 285, and 290. So based on these numbers, what kind of calculation do you do in your mind? And based on those, what is your guess for the forecast in September? Again, write them down. And once you've written it down, I would like you to consider, would you use the same rules of reasoning to calculate the forecast for both wheels and saddles, or did you use slightly different methods? Again, write them down and bring them to school, to class for discussion. Forecasting is all about uncertainty because forecast is only as good as the information included in the forecast. And it is therefore never perfect because we are always missing some information out there. That's why it's so difficult to predict the future. Uncertainty, therefore, is defined as the difference between the amount of information that we need and the amount that we already have. So when you're forecasting, you should always ask yourself, to what extent is the past related to what you expect to see in the future? When we go back to the original graph we had at the beginning of this video, you can see the question is, how accurate is this information in the past going to reflect what we expect to happen in the future? And one very nice metaphor to give you a sense of how actually uncertain forecasts are and how much prone to errors therefore a forecast is. You can describe forecasting just like driving. So imagine yourself to be on the driver's seat. but now the windshield in front of you is completely covered with snow and you cannot see forward. So you have to drive, but the only information you have to drive forward is by looking in the rear view mirror. Here you see, only by looking at what happened in the past behind you. You can see how, of course, it is quite a scary thought, right? So it's very hard to actually predict what's going to happen as you're driving forward. This kind of forecasting, predicting the future by looking at what happened in the past, is called a quantitative method. So you're relying on quantitative data and you use analytical techniques, therefore, to determine what the forecast is. There is, however, another method. It's called the qualitative method of forecasting. And this method actually is based on a subjective opinion of an expert. So it's not based on data, but on the knowledge, specific knowledge of someone that is an expert in the business. Supply chain normally has access to past sales data, so they can do quantitative forecasting. But it's always helpful when you're predicting sales to get feedback from sales and marketing. They are the one driving revenues, right? They're the one in contact with the customers. So they are, in a way, the experts in that field for what the new forecast might be. For example, they might know that a customer that we've sold for a long time now is no longer going to be in business or not longer doing business with us. Or maybe they made a new actually promotion, a new deal with a customer. So there would be instead an unexpected increase in forecast. So their input will be extremely important. In a way, if you want to look at the metaphor of driving a car, an expert is like a person that sits next to the driver, right, and has the head outside the window, and they can see forward a bit better than what the driver can. So I'll leave you with this knowledge check before we move to the time series part of this video. Can you match the names here on the left with their definitions to the right? Take a minute, you can pause the video, and then the answers are upside down here at the bottom of the slide. And if you finish with the knowledge check, we can move on to the concept of time series, which are variables measured over time in sequential order. Now, we analyze this time series to detect patterns so we can forecast. Depending on what patterns we see in the past, that might give us better indication on what will happen in the future. And there are 4 patterns we'll discuss in this class. We have trend, and then we have seasonal, cyclical, and random variation. Let's look at each of them individually. Trend is something you're probably familiar with. It's a long-term, relatively smooth pattern that persists usually for more than a year. So this is a graph. We provide you some past sales data that looks, they're quite, in a trend pattern. Can you think of any items that behaves this way? Seasonal variation is probably also something you're very familiar with, and it's a time series exhibiting a 1-year repetitive behavior. So every year you will see a peak or valley of some sort. So it's this annual yearly pattern. You might already have in mind several items that behave this way. The next one is cyclical variation. Now, a cycle is a wave-like pattern describing a long-term behavior, for example, for more than 1 year. You can tell that is relatively similar to a seasonal variation. The main difference is that it is a variation, a cycle that does not last in a year pattern, so it has different kind of time frame. Especially if it's longer than a year, I would ask you if you can think of any product that behaves this way. It can be quite challenging because, especially when you're talking about product, their life cycles is probably nowadays, a 2-year life cycle is long. So seeing a 5-year cycles like is depicted in this graph might be challenging, but let's see if you can think of any. And lastly, we have random variation. So this one is purely irregular, unpredicted changes in a time series. So by definition here is so randomized the cell pattern that you have that it's hard to determine what a forecast could be. Can you think of this, what product can behave this way? One thing that I also want you to keep in mind is that this kind of pattern, this time series, tends to hide other more predictable components, so every item might have a mix of time series, can display more than one. So you can use more than one time series when you're creating your forecast. Of course, for this class, we're going to keep things simple. But if we go back to the cyclical variation graph we just had, I wanted to show you how, can you see here there is a cycle, of course, every so many years. But you can also detect there's probably an underlying trend. So it looks like demand steadily increases. So most items have a combination of time series, and it's up to us try to capture them and to identify them. So as an exercise, let's look at these 4 products. And what I'd like you to do is to consider what your knowledge is about their, what their cell patterns could be, and identify the time series that best match them. So the first one would be soft drinks, like colas and so. We have corded mouse, writing instruments, so that's pen, markers, pencils here. And then the last one would be ponchos. Write your answers and then bring it to class for discussion. In this video, we talked about forecasting and uncertainty. We discussed the concept of quantitative, qualitative methods and how both are very helpful. And then we concluded with the time series concept of data patterns. I leave you with the last knowledge check. Can you match the names of time series with their definitions? And the answer is, again, upside down here at the bottom of the slide.